Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be ranking the albums by Material. Now, Material was a band formed in the late 70s by the genius musician, bass player, producer and experimenter Bill Laswell. Now, if you don't know who Bill Laswell is, I've done a whole video on Bill Laswell. In fact, I've done a couple. But Bill Laswell was an incredible producer. He's the guy behind Rocket by Herbie Hancock. He produced Album by Public Image Limited, which is, I think, is one of the greatest albums of the 1980s. He produced Mick Jagger, Iggy Pop, Motorhead. And Laswell's known for really fusing different styles together in really interesting ways. Now, Material is the band that I would say would be the most interesting for fans of jazz fusion, which is why I wanted to do this ranking and go through their albums. So, Material formed in around about 78, 79. It was originally a band put together by a very young Bill Laswell to make an album by David Allen from Gong, which was called New York Gong. He formed it with a guy called Michael Beinhorn, who was in Material for a certain amount of time and then left. He went on to be a producer, and he produced bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So we've got around about 7 albums. It's really difficult with Material. Anyone who's looked at Bill Laswell's discography will know there's literally hundreds of albums, and some of those albums aren't under the Material name, and I would class as Material albums. But we're not going to go there. These are the albums which have been recorded under the Material name. There's all different lineups on there, but it all focus around Bill Laswell and his experimental approach to fusing punk, jazz, free jazz, electronica, hip-hop, experimental music and ambience. Okay, so I'm going to start at the bottom of the ranking, and at the bottom I would put an album called Intonamamori. Okay, I hope I've said that right, and I've written it down there because I was sure I was going to pronounce it wrong, but this is an album that came out in 1999. And it's a perfectly good album. It's basically a hip-hop album. There's a whole bunch of guests on there. Flavor Flav is on there. Killer Priest is on there. A whole bunch of rappers. It sounds like it's been put together with loops by Laswell. And for me, it's a perfectly serviceable 90s hip-hop album. If lacking a little bit of fire, it doesn't really rate with some of the best hip-hop from the 90s. It's a perfectly serviceable, very, very well produced hip-hop album with some incredible guests on there. It seems to be a Material album in all but name. It doesn't really follow the sort of approach that we expect from Material. So this is one for jazz fusion fans especially to approach with caution. He doesn't really mess with the hip-hop genre. He stays really well within it. There's a few ambient sections on there. There's some great guests on there, but I think for the purpose of this ranking, I would put that down on the lowest one. The next one is this one, which I think is from around about 1982, I would say. I can't see a date on here, and it's One Down. Now, this is a great album. From now on, we're talking about fantastic albums, and at the top of here are some of my favourite albums of all time. This one's a very interesting album. It's got some strange guests on here, and it seems to have a flavour of disco on here. There's a very strong disco element. We've got Tony Thompson and Nile Rodgers from Chic, and there's a very strong Chic sound. This is a quite an accessible album for Material. Very funky disco music, early 80s, touches of hip hop. We've got Nona Hendryx on vocals. Laswell was producing Nona Hendryx at the time, so she crops there. We've got Nicky Scopolitis on guitar, fantastic guitarist that collaborates with Laswell and becomes one of the sort of key figures in Material. We've got, who else is on here? Daniel Ponce bongos. We've got percussion. JT Lewis on drums, and Fred Frith on guitar at one point. This is probably one of the most sort of commercial sounding records you're ever going to hear Fred Frith on. Of course, Fred Frith from Henry Cow, who also played in Naked City with John Zorn. This is a great album. I really, really like it. It's most notable for the track Memories. And Memories is a really good example of how Bill Laswell can really put disparate influences together. So on that track we have Yogi Horton on drums, Raymond Jones on piano, and then on lead vocal a very young Whitney Houston singing alongside the legendary Archie Shepp, one of the great free jazz saxophone players of all time. And this is sort of like an R&B ballad, so it's well worth checking out for memories. It's a good album. It's not in the sort of genius masterpiece level that some of these later albums will be, but this is a great album. All right, next on my list of the ranking, and I think we're looking at around about 7 albums here, is this, and this isn't technically an album, but I've included it, and I'll tell you why. This album is called Secret Life, right? When Material first formed in the late 70s, they released 2 EPs, right? Temporary Music 1 and Temporary Music 2. And there's an album's worth of stuff from that period, and it was brought together on this album, Secret Life. So this is like the sort of debut of Material. This is the first Material album I bought, and this absolutely blew me away. This is sort of, how would you describe it? Very punky, new wave jazz fusion. Laswell's created a jazz fusion style on this, which is completely new. I grew up in the early 80s. A lot of my friends were listening to, the Human League, and they were listening to Cabaret Voltaire and Bauhaus, all this stuff that was going on in the early 80s. I, of course, was listening to Chick Corea and the Mahavishnu. So when I bought this, what I heard on this was a sort of fusion between those 2 styles of music. And a lot of my friends who were into that stuff, they were absolutely blown away by this album. So this album gave me a lot of cred at the time when I got this. It is a really, really interesting album. And one of the things I found fascinating about it was just how minimal it is. So on this album we've got Bill Laswell, Fred Meyer, Michael Beinhorn, Cliff Coultree, Bill Bacon and Robert Quine. And all those musicians have come from either new wave, free jazz, that sort of area. It's an incredibly produced album. It sounds incredible. This is great if you can pick this up. If not, search out the EPs Temporary Music 1 and 2. Right, so the early Material has a very sort of new wave punky approach. Later on you start to get this sort of world music, ambient dub reggae sound, and the sort of dub reggae and touches of P-funk, and Laswell got more and more into putting disparate musicians together. This album is an absolutely fantastic album. It's really hard for me to rank the rest of these albums. They're absolutely brilliant albums now. And this is very, very interesting. And it's an example of Laswell really pushing the styles out. And it's called The Third Power. Okay? And on here is a whole host of musicians. I'm going to tell you who's on here. We have got the Jungle Brothers on vocals. We've got Jalaluddin Mansur Nuruddin on vocals from The Last Poets. Laswell produced later albums by The Last Poets. Of course, The Last Poets were a jazz poetry group, which this is really the beginnings of rap. We've got Shabba Ranks on vocals on this one. And he's on a tune called Reality, which is an incredible dub reggae tune with tons of brass on, and the sort of dub bass lines are doubled by tuba. It's an incredible sound, one of my favourite moments by Bill Laswell and Material. We've got Bootsy Collins, Gary Scheider, Gary Mudbone Cooper, all these guys from P-Funk or associated with Parliament Funkadelic. We've got Herbie Hancock on piano, Bernie Worrell on piano, Jeff Bover on synthesizers. We've got Sly Dunbar and Robbie Shakespeare on bass and drums. So we have the greatest reggae, rhythm section of all time. We've got the incredible jazz saxophone player Henry Threadgill on here. We've got Nicky Skopolitis on a guitar, and we've got Ayub Dieng on percussion. It's a mixture of this album is of world music, Indian music, dub, reggae. It's a really incredible album, and with vocals on. We've got a lot of vocals on here. There's a horn section. The horn section, believe it or not, is Fred Wesley, Maceo Parker and Pee Wee Ellis. It's James Brown's brass section on here. But that is also bumped up by another brass section of Oludara, Joe Daly, Richard Harper, Marcus Rogers and Joel Brandon. And that the lineup of that brass section is African trumpet, baritone horn, euphonium, tuba and whistling. This is an incredible sounding band. We also have a string section which is arranged and conducted by the great Carl Berger. If you want to hear what it's like to get that level of talent together in a studio and create something like you've never heard before, then this is the album to get. There's a version on here of Cosmic Slop by Parliament Funkadelic, and that's my favourite version of Cosmic Slop. When Laswell goes down the P-Funk route, he seems to outdo P-Funk. What am I saying? Should I say that? I don't know. Right, the next album is the album that was recorded just before that, and I have lost the cover, so I've made at some point in history my own cover, so I'm going to show you that, but that's not the cover. This is an album called Seven Souls. I will show you the disc inside. There it is. So I haven't got the personnel lineup, but it's a very similar lineup to what went before. It's again very dub reggae, ambient, sort of world music album with Sly and Robbie on drums and bass, if my memory serves me correctly, and it's built around poetry recitals by William Burroughs, where he describes the sort of Egyptian Book of the Dead and how when an Egyptian died, their soul transfers to the afterlife. That's about the best I can explain what it is, and it's incredible. It's informative, it's educational, and it's also very moving and dark. And Laswell's able to really get under William Burroughs and really bring out the poetry of what he's saying. It's a really incredible album. As you can tell, this album is a one-of-a-kind album. You can't go anywhere else and find anything else like this, except for the William Burroughs album that was... he did a collaboration with Michael Franti's band, the Disposable Heroes of Hippocracy, called Spare Us Annie. That's an incredible album as well. So there's a little bit of a, you know, if you like that album, go and check out that album. I've got it somewhere. I should have pulled it out, but I forgot. So, but this one I would say is a little bit better, because Laswell, being such an incredible producer, is able to really marry up the dialogue, the poetry with the music, and he's really exploring that sort of Egyptian string sound on here. There's not so much soloing on here. It's not as jazzy as the third power of the album I just discussed before, but it's almost like William Burroughs is the jazz musician on here. This is a really incredible album. Right, so we're on to the last two now on this, and this is an absolute masterpiece. This is recorded by the first version of Material, and it's called Memory Serves. This is possibly the jazz fusion statement of this band. It's got an incredible lineup on it, and this is instrumental. It's very close to Ornette Coleman's Prime Time, but nothing like it, because it's far darker and far more sort of world music-y, and it's really hard to explain, but you can tell that it's sort of exploring the harmonic ideas of Ornette Coleman. The lineup is, on guitar, the incredible free jazz guitarist Sonny Sharrock, and the incredible free jazz guitarist Fred Frith, as we mentioned before, Henry Threadgill on alto saxophone. We have George Lewis on trombone, Oludara on trumpet, Billy Bang on violin, you know, one of the great 1960s jazz violinists, Charles K. Noyes on drums, bells and percussion, and the great Fred Mayer on drums, guitar and percussion, and of course Bill Laswell on bass and Michael Beanhorn on synthesizers. This, if you're a jazz fusion fan, you want to check out Bill Laswell, you want to check out Material, this is a really good album to go for. But perhaps slightly not, slightly a little bit, tiny bit, not as good as this, which is a real masterpiece. This is one of my favourite albums of all time, and and anyone who comes to me and asks me about Bill Laswell and want to check him out, this is the album I usually point them towards. Hallucination Engine, from I think the early 90s, yeah, 94. This is an incredible album, and I'm going to really go through this in detail. The lineup is, let's pull it out properly because it's quite incredible. Alright, so Bill Laswell on bass, beats, loops and samples. Wayne Shorter on soprano and tenor sax from Weather Report. And it's one of Wayne Shorter's great moments to hear that saxophone wrapped up within Bill Laswell production is an incredible thing. William Burroughs, there's one track which is actually a remix of a Billy Cobham track. I'm pretty sure it's it could be Red Baron, where they've taken loops from that and they've combined that in sort of a remix with a William Burroughs poem. It's completely different to what he does on Seven Souls. It's much funkier. Louis Solar on voice, Simon Shaheen on violin and oud, Nicky Scopolitis, this is one of the standard material musicians on electric guitars, Bonnie Ware on keyboards. He was almost like a member of Material at this point. Bootsy Collins on bass, El Shanker, just done a video on Shakti, the great El Shanker on electric violin, Sly Dunbar, Sly Robbie on drums, Jeff Bover on synthesizers, Jihad Rassi on ney, with a lot of sort of African Indian percussion on here. Jonas Hellborg, the incredible Jonas Hellborg, one of the great bass players of the last 40 years on acoustic bass and fretless bass. He actually appears as a version of Naima by John Coltrane on here, and he appears on that. Zakir Hussain on tabla, Trilok Gurtu on tabla. We've got half of Shakti on this album. Oh, because we got Viku Vinikayam on Gatam, so we've got everyone from Shakti except for John McLaughlin. I didn't realise that. That's the first time I've realised that they're all on this album. Fahim Dandan on voice, George Bazil on Quanun. I hope I am pronouncing these things correctly. Michael Bakluk on Daf and tambourine, and Ayub Dieng on chatan, congas and percussion. This album is a proper jazz fusion album. It opens with two tracks, Black Light and Mantra. Mantra utilises Wayne Shorter, and then later on we get a remix of Cucumber Slumber by Weather Report. So this is the album where he's really exploring jazz fusion. As I said on Words of Advice, we get bits of Billy Cobham coming in off Spectrum, Ruins and Internal Drift, Shadows of Paradise. They're sort of much more ambient pieces, and there's a pretty long track called Hidden Garden, which is very dubby, and that's the one where you sort of in the middle of that you hear Naima by Coltrane. It's exploring those areas, exploring the areas of jazz fusion. So that's my number one for Material. Now before I go, I want to mention some of the albums that you should check out as well, which are Material albums in all but name, you know, unlike the first album I covered, and that would be the early '80s Herbie Hancock albums, including the album that contains Rocket. Public Image Limited album, that's another album which is pretty much like a Material album. And also another album to check out, which is very jazzy and jazz fusiony, although very harmonic, is Bill Laswell's solo album called Basslines. So I hope for some of you who are big Laswell fans, I have been able to cover those albums for you. Excuse me. Sorry, my wife's calling me in for my dinner right now. I was trying to ignore her. She's waving at me, and I'm trying to ignore her. She can see me talking to the camera. But my dinner's ready now, right? So I'm done, aren't I? I'm going to go and have my dinner. Thanks for watching this video. If you like, If you want to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.